John Sidilidis, welcome to this episode of Risk Matters.
Great to be with you again, Arion. Thank you for having me and giving me the opportunity to share my insights with your very distinguished audience.
Thank you, John, and it's a great pleasure. You were the first person that we spoke to in January of this year. Now we're a little bit before Christmas, so you'll be the last person to sort of round things off. There were several things on the agenda at that time, the Trump 2.0 foreign policy strategy. And now, of course, we come to the end of the year. How have things evolved over 2025? And what do you see as the main items on the Trump foreign policy agenda for 2026?
Well, we're fresh off of the release of the Trump White House National Security Strategy, which really in many ways is going to be a guiding document, not only for those of us here in the United States, but our allies, our partners, and frankly, our adversaries around the world to better understand the prioritization of U.S. foreign policy currently and for the next 3 years for the remainder of the Trump administration. But I think that's going to be sort of a guiding post here, Arian, for what the Trump policy will look like, especially the prioritization of the Western Hemisphere again, in a way that we really haven't seen maybe since the 1980s, when we had the communist wars of insurrection in Central America. We had the invasion of Grenada in 1983 and the invasion of Panama in 1989. And maybe even going back several decades before then, when John F. Kennedy, as president, spoke about a brand new future for the United States and its neighbors throughout the Western Hemisphere. And it's been largely a neglected area, even though it's our neighborhood for the last 30, 40 years since the end of the Cold War. And so we see a resurgence of national primacy, both within the United States, which we'll talk about at length, but also a restoration of American dominance of the Western Hemisphere, sending a very clear message to malign powers such as China, Russia, and Iran, all of which have established different types of footholds, whether they're infrastructure projects from Beijing under the Belt Road Initiative, whether it's Russian military hardware and trainers for repressive police forces in Central America and the Caribbean and in South America, or whether it's Iran, which has sent its terrorist proxy into Hezbollah into Venezuela to conduct narcotics trafficking, money laundering, and to be able to train Venezuelan police in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon under Hezbollah trainers. So we have a very different environment here in the Western Hemisphere. And I think the first order of business for the Trump administration outside the United States, where we also have a very important foreign policy consideration in terms of protecting our borders and making sure that the Texas-Mexico border is the last line of defense, not the first line of defense against mass migration from the Western Hemisphere and frankly from other parts of the world coming into the Western Hemisphere. So all of this means a very different prioritization for this administration than anything we've seen in U.S. foreign policy in decades.
John, seeing you've talked about the Western Hemisphere, let's stay on that issue before we move to Europe. We've been hearing about the plans for Venezuela, whether there may be an invasion or some sort of military action there. What exactly would that look like? And once the U.S. achieves its military goals, what would the country look like in terms of who would run it and what it would look like long term? Because obviously, and for a lot of our viewers in Europe, the last time the U.S. did something similar, I guess, was in Iraq, which didn't turn out very well. How would this be a success in terms of the thinking of the Trump administration, if indeed it goes ahead?
Well, Arian, first I would say there's really no comparison to Iraq here. That was a very different type of operation. It was just on the heels of the invasion of Afghanistan and the ouster of the Taliban. And we were genuinely concerned, even if many of the European and US intelligence services failed in their analysis, but we were very much concerned at that time that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction that might be conveyed to terrorist organizations engaged in catastrophic acts of terrorism right on the heels of the September 11th, 2001 attacks on the US homeland. So it was a very different environment then. This is really more a matter of straightening out a very imbalanced, disordered balance of power in the Western Hemisphere. We're not really clear what the goals are, though. I mean, President Trump has not given a speech that details what his objectives are. Instead, we're getting piecemeal tidbits in social media and in remarks to the like. And originally, we thought that maybe the goal here was regime behavior change in Caracas, so that maybe Maduro would remain in power, but would start to realign his country's foreign policy and economic policy, and frankly, energy policy, with that of the United States and his South American neighbors. But it seems lately like it's more a regime change. And as President Trump has noted, we have the largest armada in the Caribbean that we've had in at least decades, all massed in the Caribbean Sea just north of Venezuela, although there have been actually talks between President Trump and Nicolas Maduro. And we're not privy to what exactly those talks comprise, but there seems to be a sense of how do we negotiate the departure of Nicolas Maduro and the potential restoration of a democratic government, a normal country, not a terrorist feeding country that's aligned with China and Russia, and destabilizing many of its neighbors in South America, and frankly, also an end to calls for an invasion by Venezuela of its neighbor Guyana to the east, which now has tremendous reserves of oil that are being exploited for global market commercialization. So it seems to be a regime change, but one that is as peaceful and orderly as possible, maybe provide some type of safe haven for Maduro and his cronies, and again, to restore democracy to Venezuela and to have it function as a normal country. Remember, it has the world's largest proven reserves of oil anywhere in the world, and yet it has become totally impoverished under utterly failed socialist policies of the last 2.5 decades. So we'll see how this all plays out. We don't know how long this will take and whether or not it will even succeed. But I don't see anything along the lines of an amphibious invasion of Venezuela. Again, this is a president who is very proud of his no new major wars in his first term. He ran as a peacemaker in 2024. He's very proud to, from his perspective, to have brought about an end or a suspension of kinetic operations in 8 conflicts around the world. So I don't think we're looking at a war here, but I think what you do see is extraordinarily coercive diplomacy, backed by the greatest military in the world, in order to persuade Maduro that the best future for him, his family, and for his country is for him to depart and to allow for an orderly restoration of normal, democratic, free market, capitalist governance in Venezuela.
Thank you, John. And I think that's a good analysis. As you said, the president ran very much on being a peacemaker. I remember I was at his speech at CPAC earlier in the year, where I think he used the term peacemaker probably about 7 times during that speech. And obviously, people around the world obviously want to see more end to conflicts as opposed to new ones starting. With that, though, in terms of the concern, and we started talking about the national security strategy. That has caused some concern here in Europe among certain European leaders. Tell us whether or not you think that concern is legitimate, or if it's justified, or if it's unfounded and maybe exaggerated.
I think it depends on what parts of Europe we're talking about. I mean, Europe is obviously not a single cohesive bloc. It's certainly not a country by any standards. It's the geographic western tip of the massive Eurasian continent, but it is in many ways maybe our most important trading partners anywhere in the world when you look at the European Union. But I think it's very interesting the way the Trump administration is framing our transatlantic ties in sort of parallel lines. There's a NATO component to the national security strategy, and there's a European Union component. And it may not be very blatant, but I think to a large degree, President Trump is quite pleased that our NATO allies in Europe, and frankly, Canada, which has also been a very weak partner in terms of security, along with Spain and Italy, down at the 1.2 or 1.4% of GDP on defense expenditures range, far below what was committed by every country in NATO in 2014 to President Obama at the Wales Summit in Scotland to reach 2% of GDP. And now President Trump has successfully negotiated a target of 5% in all NATO countries. Now, the degree to which countries actually meet that 5%, and I believe it's more along the lines of 3.5% in actual defense hardware systems and 1.5% in defense-related infrastructure improvements and the like, but ultimately 5% to beef up their own defense under the rubric of burden shifting, Arion, not burden sharing. That Europe today is not the Europe of the 1940s and 1950s, utterly ravaged by world war, poor, destitute, and and the U.S. opening up its markets to help Europe rebuild. The European Union as a bloc is extraordinarily wealthy. However, with the peace dividend at the end of the Cold War, we've seen a European Union shift away from just a free trade bloc to this transnational entity that seems to have transferred significant sovereignty from its constituent members to technocrats in Brussels, who really have become quite complacent about the security threat, whether it's from Russia, whether it's from Iran. One of the things that we never talk about is, even if it's not directed or controlled, the mass migration waves from the African countries that are going to be a perennial problem for Europe, that Europe seems to have no real solution for. And I think what President Trump is looking to do is, on the one hand, being congratulatory to the NATO partners for taking their own defense seriously so that we have quote unquote fighting allies, Arion. And here I'll use the Israeli example where with Operation Midnight Hammer, the Israelis were the ones that took out Iran's air defenses and air force and everything that would then open up the way for the US to send B-2 stealth bombers from Missouri in the heartland of the United States on a 38-hour mission, a flawless mission to then obliterate Iran's nuclear weapons programs. But Israel did all of the laying up, all the dirty work necessary for the US to come in and execute these strikes, very targeted strikes. Similarly, it's for Europe to defend Europe primarily, with the US providing, of course, the nuclear security umbrella, and to provide for the kinds of targeted strikes in the event of a conflict that could help tilt a conflict in Europe's favor. But it's not for the US to defend Europe if Europe doesn't seem to be taking its own security very seriously. So I think that's what's happening there on the NATO side, but the European Union side is, I think, where there's great discord between Washington and Brussels. And as we see with the comments about the potential for civilizational erasure in Europe, the administration wants very much to see a strong, self-confident, reassured, robust Europe. And not just in terms of the European Union, which is, again, kind of transmogrified from the steel and coal community of the 1950s as a free trade bloc to something that is exercising unelected, unaccountable control over various European countries and societies and citizenries, but that Europe is allowing itself to engage in very dangerous multiculturalism, is looking the other way as the great histories and cultures of individual European countries are seemingly sacrificed, again, because of a lack of confidence, a lack of pride in the great histories of our European partners, and also very, I would say, misguided energy policies for the sake of climate fanaticism and extraordinarily ambitious climate goals when, since the invasion by Russia of Ukraine in 2022, we come to realize that any industrial power that is reliant on hostile adversaries for energy is exposing its vulnerabilities to a very dangerous degree. And we've seen that playing out with the deindustrialization of major economies such as Germany and the United Kingdom over the last half decade or so. So I think the US wants to see Europe restored to what it once was, if I may, make Europe great again. Now, the tone is a very difficult one, and some can argue that maybe tough love isn't the proper messaging for a public national security strategy, and much of this could have been conveyed privately. But my sense is that much of it has been conveyed privately, going back to the first Trump administration, going back to the early months of this year, of 2025. And the sense is that there are too many European leaders, especially technocrats and bureaucrats in Brussels, who continue to disregard this concern from the United States that Europe is allowing itself to slip backwards. And we want the strongest, most robust, most self-confident, and most militarily assured and reindustrialized Europe possible.
John, well, first of all, that was a very thorough analysis, so thank you for that. You know, you hear, for example, that the German military is now, beefing up its capabilities, that they sort of telegraphing that there may be some sort of conflict with Russia. Russia has never said that it actually wants to invade Western Europe. In terms of your understanding of big power politics, what would the scenario look like where Russia and certain European countries would come into conflict? Meaning that there's obviously the invasion of Ukraine. Does that necessarily mean that because they've gone to Ukraine that now they will enter other European countries? Or is it a message by European leaders in order to sort of spur more defense spending just in case something happens? What does the landscape look like in terms of some sort of conflict between Russia and any Western European country?
I think your latter point is really the one that we should focus on more, Arion. I have really seen no significant evidence that Vladimir Putin has any actual intention of invading a single square inch of NATO territory. Why risk war with the United States? Remember, Ukraine is not a NATO ally. There was never any legal obligation on the part of the United States or our NATO partners in Europe and in Canada to do anything in defense of Ukraine. And for that matter, if we're perfectly honest about this, Ukraine was already invaded under the Obama administration in 2014. And there was barely a ripple. I mean, there were some puny sanctions placed on Russia in 2014 and 2015, but Angela Merkel continued to build out the Nord Stream pipeline, despite the warnings from the Trump administration. And President Trump famously, we see that video now from the United Nations when he spoke to the General Assembly and publicly warned Germany that becoming dependent for energy on Russia was a fool's errand, and the German diplomats laughing at him. And now, as I mentioned before, we have a rapidly deindustrializing Germany as a result of that foolish policy. But I don't really see a realistic scenario where Russia invades kinetically, that is, an armored assault as we saw against Ukraine in 2022. And since then, even against smaller countries like Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia, let alone what's going to become the military colossus of Poland, which will likely become the most powerful military in NATO alongside Turkey. But I do see continued probable destabilization by Russia against especially the Baltic countries and Poland. We see cybersecurity attacks throughout NATO, mostly from Russian actors, whether they're state actors or non-state actors. It's difficult to trace, but we can assume that there's a wink and a nod of approval from Vladimir Putin on these types of, again, hybrid assaults on European political and economic entities. We're seeing, obviously, attacks on undersea cables that will very much affect the telecommunications network grid, not only throughout Europe, but connecting Europe to North America and other parts of the world. So I think as long as we have this very volatile situation with the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, we're going to see continued attacks by Russian state and non-state actors against European countries. But I don't see any reason why any rational actor, and I presume that Vladimir Putin may be a very evil man, but I see him as ultimately quite rational, would want to initiate a war with the United States. So I don't see any realistic scenario. I think your comment is spot on, Arion, where especially the German Chancellor, Mr. Merz, and other European officials are talking about the need to better defend their societies and Europe at large, because they're going to have to sell increased defense budgets to societies and to voter bases that have been accustomed to relatively puny defense budgets in favor of extended social welfare benefits. We know that most European countries are famous for very generous cradle to grave social welfare entitlements. And there will have to be a trade off now because the European economies are not growing as fast as we would like them to be able to provide for those continued generous benefits and to increase defense spending. So I think political leaders are preparing their voters, their societies, for very difficult debates in the months and years ahead. And keep in mind, Arion, there was a poll, and pardon me, I forget which organization took it, but I believe it was quite a reputable one that demonstrated that most young men in most European countries have no desire to defend their own country, let alone a third country like Ukraine. So, how do you take largely pacifist elements, especially in a country like Germany, right? At the economic core, at the heart of Europe, most German men have no interest in defending Germany against any external threat. Now, is that because that's still largely a fantastical scenario? And if there actually were a kinetic conflict, you'd have a very different opinion, potentially. But right now, there's a complacency in most of Europe that the Russian threat really is not that serious against Europe, but one more, I think, of solidarity between most Europeans and their fellow Europeans as they see them that are besieged by the Russian military in Ukraine.
And John, that's a very interesting point because obviously ramping up defense spending and having a army that's battle ready is not something that just takes a few months or a few years. Right. It obviously requires infrastructure and spending and the national psyche. I say this again, and I'll make a little plug for our little country, Cyprus, that has been occupied now for over 50 years, 37% of it by Turkey. That, you know, for us, it's an existential threat. And if there were a war, I believe that a lot of the young men would defend their country because obviously the invader is there and the country is currently occupied. But I think that when you talk about invasions that will take place from far away, and, you know, sort of scenarios that people don't see as realistic, it may be a little bit different. John, how do you see a potential peace deal in Ukraine? Do you see that something like that would happen in 2026?
We're all praying for peace. We have been since the invasion, Arion. It's very difficult to see how the parties come together anytime in the near future, especially on the Russian side, because I think Putin feels that he can continue to attrit the Ukrainian military and NATO's support for Ukraine's military over time. And they have been making incremental gains territorially, of course, at extraordinary human cost, but that seems to be less of a concern for Vladimir Putin because he's mostly conscripting troops from Central and Eastern Russia. And that's not really affecting his voter base or his economic base or political base, for that matter, in cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg and other more European cities in the western part of the country. So he seems to be willing to continue to send more troops into Ukraine. We also have had, of course, the phenomenon of several tens of thousands of North Korean troops that have been assisting the Russian troops. And the Ukrainian army, right now, the average age of a Ukrainian soldier is maybe late 30s, early 40s. They're running out of hardware. There's no new major weapons grants coming from the United States. There hasn't been any agreement out of Washington since the last year of the Biden administration in April of 2024. And President Trump has made very clear any American weapons that are going to Ukraine going forward are going to have to be purchased by our NATO partners in Europe, and they can grant them to Ukraine, but we're not granting any more weapons to Ukraine. So I think Putin feels that he can continue to put maximalist demands on the table, certainly in terms of territory, in terms of recognition of acquiring territory that the Russian forces don't even occupy today in the Donbass, formal recognition of Crimea, and also ethnic rights for Russian speakers and the Russian Orthodox churches in eastern Ukraine. On the other hand, Zelensky has a very difficult sell to his own people because most Ukrainians, if you look at the polls, are exhausted of the war. But there are very, very important, one might say, extremist elements that are determined to continue fighting. And if Zelensky was seen as compromising too deeply and too quickly to Putin, we don't know to what extent he would be able to physically survive. assassination, overthrow, ouster from Kiev. And of course, there's now the issue of whether or not there'll be democratic elections in Ukraine, as there have been, say, in Israel, when Israel was under military siege. But Zelensky is under great pressure now from the Trump administration and from other outside parties to conduct democratic elections, but it's very difficult to do so under these wartime conditions. So I don't know that we have anything that's going to be an enduring, comprehensive settlement, Arian. And of course, that also complicates the matter because Zelensky is calling for a ceasefire. Putin doesn't want a ceasefire. Putin wants an all-out comprehensive settlement that assures him that Ukraine will never become a NATO member and that there'll be no US or other NATO military presence to speak of in Ukraine that can threaten Moscow's security through its Ukrainian underbelly, so to speak. So I think there's going to be continued negotiations. I think Putin very much wants to reassure Trump that he will continue to participate in talks, but I don't see where there's any significant end to this anytime soon, short of utter Ukrainian capitulation. And I don't know how our European allies would sign off on anything that they feel would be a great threat to their security. Keep in mind, the greater the Russian presence in Ukraine, the more countries along Europe's eastern frontier, namely Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, even Turkey, and potentially Greece in the Black Sea and Aegean theaters would be very much affected by that kind of Russian dominance of the Black Sea region and the borders between Ukraine, Belarus, and Central Europe. So it's extraordinarily complicated. But I will say one thing, Arian. I'm very heartened that there is a serious effort, and I give this Trump administration great credit. We can question whether or not the process is the ideal one, but there is a serious effort, as there had been for now a number of months, to bring about peace between Russia and Ukraine. And I think that's in everyone's interest, an honorable peace. And I'll close on this. It's not just an honorable peace for Ukraine, because it's obviously the losing party here. And the longer the war goes on, the more that Ukraine's economy is devastated, its energy infrastructure grid is devastated, its population is besieged. But this settlement is also going to have to recognize, unfortunately for Europe, that Russia does have serious security concerns. And there will be a new European security architecture that balances Europe's need to be safe from ongoing Russian threats with Russia's reassurance that there won't be any further NATO encroachment on its western frontier.
No, it seems like there has to be a sort of balance of concerns between the two sides, and hopefully they would find a way to work with each other.
We actually see language in the just released national security strategy that calls ultimately for, I think the phrase is strategic stability between Europe and Russia to bring about an enduring peace and prosperity to that part of the Eurasian landmass. But the phrasing here that is the goal of the Trump administration is strategic stability between Brussels and Moscow.
Is the Trump administration's policy to decouple Russia from China, or is that a very difficult policy, again, using the Kissinger axiom that the US needs to be closer to Russia or China, but that those two should not be closer to each other than they are to the US?
It's going to be a very difficult objective to achieve, but President Trump, I think, has been quite open about how foolish American foreign policy and, frankly, Western or, say, European policy has been in driving Russia deeper into the arms of a very happy China. I mean, if you take Russia's 5,000 to 6,000 nuclear weapons and its extraordinarily rich commodities and natural resources inventory, right? I mean, it's not just a nuclear superpower, it's a commodity superpower. And you combine that with China's industrial might, now accounting for anywhere between 30 to 32% of global industrial output, and an extraordinarily powerful Chinese military that is looking to project power deep into the Indo-Pacific region. The last thing that anyone would want for global stability is a stronger union between the Chinese Communist Party and Vladimir Putin and his kleptocracy in Moscow. But it's going to be very difficult to drive a wedge between those two, given the fact that even though they are probably strategic adversaries and rivals in Central and Western Asia, or Eurasia for that matter, Eastern Eurasia, tactically, they're very much aligned right now against what they see as a US-led global international trading system. So tactical allies and partners, yes. Can we drive a wedge between them? We certainly can do it as long as Putin feels that the West is allied against him in Ukraine and is looking to weaken, if not outright dismember, Russia, which has really been the objective, I think, of a number of our European partners who've spoken openly about dismembering Russia, as well as a number of serious policy analysts here in Washington, D.C. But it's going to be very difficult. And I think what President Trump is looking to do is to provide incentives for Putin to look at, say, to put away the ideological foundations of this anti-Western bias in the last 15, 20 years, and to move towards economic, energy, and technological cooperation, whether it's energy projects in the strategic theater of the Arctic region, whether it's space cooperation, and other forms of technology cooperation that can bring Russia, the US, and eventually Russia and Europe, if not necessarily closer together, but to normalize the diplomatic and commercial ties and persuade Putin that his country's future is not safe in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party, many of whose acolytes have been open about the fact that, say, the far eastern portion of Russia, Manchuria, is actually historic Chinese territory. One can argue there are more Chinese laborers working in the forests and the mines of eastern Russia than there are Russians. And who's to say that there wouldn't be another war between China and Russia, as there was in 1969, I believe, between China and the Soviet Union, that would involve a China grab at all of that very valuable, very rich natural resource territory in Manchuria and in Siberia.
John, we'll close on the topic of the Eastern Mediterranean, and you mentioned some of the energy projects. Obviously, there's now a lot of energy cooperation taking place. Greece is playing a major role in that, and there's the sort of energy corridor that's being designed. How do you see the next steps in that project?
Arion, it's fascinating from my perch here in Washington, D.C., where we see probably the greatest, tightest, most robust commercial ties between the U.S. and Greece anytime in our adult memory, certainly in the last 4 decades. And much of this is predicated on strategic geography that Greece possesses in the realigned security framework of Southern Europe, the East Med, and frankly, the Middle East. And if one looks at, say, simply the announcements in recent weeks with the Energy Secretary of the United States, Chris Wright, and Interior Secretary Doug Burgum, along with Deputy Secretary of State Michael Regas in Greece I think it was in November, signing on to new energy deals, helping to encourage companies like ExxonMobil to conduct oil and gas exploration in the Ionian Sea and in the Sea of Crete, and joining another major U.S. company, Chevron, which is already operating in Greece's exclusive economic zone for new energy finds. Of course, the vertical corridor now has been signed into as an official agreement between the U.S. and Greece to provide for energy, transportation, and logistics corridors from Greece's northern ports like Thessaloniki, Kavala, and Alexandroupolis through Bulgaria, Romania, Moldova into Ukraine, and then potentially additional linkages further up into Central and Eastern Europe into, say, Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, and the Baltic countries. And Arion, I like to say that the current 3 Seas initiative that has been in place for a number of years among a number of Central and Eastern European countries whose territory and the corridors on top of their respective territories links the 3 seas of the Baltic, the Black, and the Adriatic Seas, would be doubled effectively, with Greece's joining the 3 Seas initiative and then linking those corridors, energy and transportation and logistics corridors, to the 3 seas around Greece, the Aegean Sea, the Ionian Sea, and the Mediterranean Sea, and providing this vast and deep and very, very robust transportation corridor, not replacing, but complementing the east-west trade corridors going back for the last 100, 150 years, especially Russia through Central Europe to Western Europe, and now connecting north-south, Scandinavia and the Baltic countries deep into the Aegean and Mediterranean seas. So we have the 3Cs/6Cs initiative. We have the vertical corridor. We have the 3+1 energy projects that bring together Greece, Cyprus, and Israel. First for this electricity interconnector. There are some glitches right now that the various governments have to work out, but I think that's still a very ambitious and doable project. We may see a restoration of the Greece, Cyprus, Israel natural gas pipeline, which the Biden administration unfortunately withdrew its support for back in January of 2022. But if the governments and really the engineers can develop a system that can withstand the earthquake tremors beneath the Mediterranean Sea and also some of the deep abysses of the seabed of the Mediterranean Sea, then that could come back to life. And I think a very ambitious and very hopeful project that's gaining significant support here in Washington, Arion, is IMEC, the India, Middle East, Europe corridor, which would physically link the vast markets in countries like India and South Asia across the Arabian Sea to land terminals in the United Arab Emirates, building out vast new energy, rail, transportation, and telecommunications links across the vast desert expanse of Saudi Arabia through Jordan to the Haifa port of Israel, and then from there, shipping lanes that would connect with ports in Cyprus. And Nicosia could serve a very important role as an administrative center, overseeing all of the logistics and the connections of this vast, I think it's a 3,000 to 4,000 mile corridor connecting Cyprus and then Greece. And whether it's Piraeus, it may not be because of the Chinese company Costco's control over most of that port, but it could be the newly developing port of Elefsina, it could be Alexandroupolis, and then also other European ports such as Trieste and others in Italy and in France. But this vast new corridor, and Greece and Cyprus at the heart of this IMEC corridor. And one other very hopeful note, if I might add, if Gaza can be rebuilt in the next 5 to 10 years, especially with funds coming in from very wealthy Gulf Cooperation Council countries, because I think it's really up to the fellow Arab Muslims of the Palestinians to be able to provide for the reopening, the reconstruction of Gaza, then you could have Gaza as a parallel port alongside that of Haifa if you can ever have a normal government in Gaza, as opposed to a barbaric terrorist organization, Hamas, which it seems right now no one except Turkey is willing to try to disarm. Although, honestly, I'm quite skeptical that Turkey's aim is to disarm Hamas. They, of course, have been supporters of Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood writ large, and it's why Israel wants no part of Turkey and Gaza. So I think that's going to be a thorny issue, maybe a side obstacle to building out IMEC. I hope not, and I think most of the other countries that I just mentioned are also looking for ways to collaborate more deeply and more formally to build out this vast new corridor over the next decade or so.
John, last question to bring it back to Cyprus and Greece and Turkey. Do you think that citizens in Greece and Cyprus should feel safer in terms of any aggressive behavior by Turkey, given all of these developments that you've talked about?
It's a good question. It's a tough question, Arion. You know, Erdogan, if one is objective about this, has in really many ways over the last 22 years that he's been in power, at least for Greece and for Cyprus, been far more bark than bite. Okay? Talks a very nasty game, talks about taking out, attacking, Athens in the middle of the night, that missiles can come raining down on Greece. Very tough talk against Cyprus, and again, sort of spoiling the efforts of the United Nations to bring about some type of a settlement of Cyprus, especially now that there is a leader of the Turkish Cypriot community in those elections that may be more amenable to a diplomatic solution to Cyprus, and Erdogan pretty much reining him in and saying that Ankara will decide the future of Cyprus, not the Turkish Cypriot community. But again, if we look at history, it was the Kemalists that invaded Cyprus. It was the Kemalists that gave us the IMEC crisis in 1996. It was the Kemalists that threatened to take out Cyprus's S-300s in 1997 and 1998. And again, maybe at least to date, more bark than bite, sometimes pushing the envelope very hard, as we saw in August of 2020, when the Turkish military pushed away those Italian scientific exploratory vessels. And we had the UAE and France and Russia and the US all in the air and sea around the Eastern Mediterranean. So that was a very tense month or so, but it's been relatively quiet for the last 4 or 5 years. I hope that it stays that way, but again, President Erdogan being the mercurial leader, looking to expand his power base now that he believes, significant influence with the new Syrian government, looking to offer Turkish military forces to help, quote unquote, disarm Hamas, as we just noted, and stabilize the situation in Gaza, which I think Israel will likely not permit, but also pursuing Syrian Kurds in the eastern part of that country, and of course maintaining their military occupation of northern Iraq as well. And as the people of Cyprus know very well, when Turkish military forces come in, they tend to never leave. So I think that's going to be a larger dilemma in the Middle East. But I think for now, hopefully Erdogan will remain more bark than bite. But I would say going forward, in a post-Erdogan Turkey, the return of the Kemalists could pose a very dangerous future for Cyprus and for Greece. We don't know whether those Kemalists would be more hardline nationalists, a la the MHP and the Grey Wolves, or whether they might actually be more European types, really genuinely seeking to harmonize Turkish domestic and foreign policy with that of the European Union. But that's a future scenario that we really can't predict accurately right now.
John, thank you very much for that. We'll close here. Let me wish you and your family Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And let's do this again in 2026.
Oh, thank you again, Arion, for having me. I wish your distinguished audience good health and great strength in the new year and beyond. Thank you so much for having me.